As you all know, with the COVID epidemic that's going on, that vaccine is going to be the salvation of us. And so, the more information we can gather about the vaccine, the more educated and also the more helpful we'll be to our patients. With that, I would like to introduce our speaker. Meg Frazier is the Senior Director for Vaccine Medical Business Unit for Pfizer Pharmaceuticals. And she comes to us having graduated from Purdue, went to the IU School of Medicine, from there to the University of Iowa for internal medicine, then back to IU for neurology, and thus she has had an extensive CV listing clinical trials and is well published after that. Bringing that wealth of experience, she still has some part-time interest at JWM Neurology in Indianapolis and is on the advisory board, BMD Disability Review, as some outside interest to Pfizer. So with that, Meg, take it away.
That's great. Can you hear me?
I can.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to share my screen if I can, and let me know if you can see. Can you
Still
see it?
working.
Okay.
Not just yet. We're still working on it.
I was going to say, I wondered if you I am going to try it again and see what we can do here.
Okay, something seems like it's coming up here.
All right.
There we go. We've got the slide view with the individual slides on the left.
Perfect. Yes. And I'm going to I will tell you that it seems as though on Teams, and I apologize for not being able to use video for whatever reason. We don't have administrator rights to Teams at Pfizer, so we can't show our video of ourselves. So I do apologize about that. I will also tell you that sometimes when I put things in slide presentation mode, then I can't advance. So I'm going to go ahead and try it. And then if we get stuck, which sometimes happens, then what I might do is have to go back in and show it in the original view I just had it in. But the purpose of today really is to talk about vaccine confidence, and it's always important, but even more so now. And this kind of gives you an overview of what the goals of today's presentation might be. Give you a little bit of history, but there are a couple of very key slides, I think, that are very pertinent to what we are going through currently. So we know vaccines are a very significant public health concern. And one of the things that I always mention here is that there's a lot of discussion about herd immunity, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But when we think about infectious disease, we very, very rarely achieve herd immunity through the natural course of the disease process. Just about every infectious disease that we have achieved herd immunity with, including measles and smallpox and polio, has been through vaccines. And we'll talk about measles in the context of contagion a little bit later when we're talking about herd immunity, but we need to keep in mind that vaccine preventable diseases really achieve herd immunity through vaccination. The other problem is that vaccine preventable diseases, we all know, have a huge range, and that includes COVID. And we don't always know beforehand whether somebody's going to have a serious case or a more mild case. I find this slide very interesting because this predates COVID. But you can see that even in 2019, the WHO listed vaccine hesitancy in the top 10 major threats to global health. And that really is more of an issue, vaccine hesitancy, in the wealthier countries. So those countries that have achieved a point where they don't remember diphtheria and pertussis and measles and mumps and the complications therein. So it's really, vaccine hesitancy is something you see in countries that have been privileged enough to have vaccinations in the past. Vaccine attitudes really are a continuum. So you have the acceptors and you have the complete rejectors, and thankfully the complete rejectors are a relatively small percentage of the total population, probably under 10% or so. But there is a big centrist group that are vaccine hesitant and or late vaccinators, and those are individuals to whom healthcare providers can really reach. And what you'll find is that group is very open to the healthcare provider and what they have to say. I'm going to talk about the undermining confidence first, because we're seeing a lot of that right now. And for those people who are interested, there's something called Project VCTR, which is a national project that talks about all of the different regions and the misinformation that's present in all the different regions. And it really does vary, West Coast, East Coast, Midwest, and South, but it's fascinating. There is a very small subset where it's cultural issues and belief systems, but a lot of what undermines confidence really is misinformation, and it's so easy to transmit. Of course, as is true for the pandemic currently, because even potentially of the name Operation Warp Speed, there is a lot of concern now with respect to authorities in the government in terms of trust. And we have seen that with the politicalization of COVID-19. But there are many ways to promote confidence. Really, healthcare providers are probably the number one way, but I think we can collaborate and partner between industry, academia, the government to help with transparency and improve confidence. Vaccine confidence is a little bit of a broad term, but the CDC had recommended, probably mid-year this year, that rather than focusing on the more negative connotation of hesitancy, that we focus on confidence, more of the positive, and that healthcare providers utilize the word confidence in the way they manifest their interaction with their patients. We have a very interesting current confidence environment, and we've talked about that a little bit with the politicalization of COVID-19, yes, but we're getting a lot of horizontal communication more than from a hierarchy. So more than from the HCP to the patient, we're seeing a lot of virtual communities, and it's so easy for anybody who thinks similarly to self-organize. And if you even think about it, when you are searching on Google, for example, if you've already previously searched for negative adverse events, for example, with vaccines, then every time you plug in the word vaccines, you're likely to get information that supports the way you think. And that is something that we need to think about when we think about all of the search windows that we use. It really helps in the virtual community sense, those individuals to self-organize around misinformation. The other thing, of course, is that there's a very rapid global sharing of misinformation going on right now between countries, and it can be different from one country to another. For example, in the United Kingdom, apparently there is a concept that if you get measles, rather than be vaccinated against measles, if you get measles, it might make your child smarter. And that has been broadly manifested within the United Kingdom. Thank heavens it doesn't seem to be over here in the United States yet, but it shows how quickly misinformation can spread. And as a neurologist, I can categorically tell you that getting measles will not improve your cognitive skills. And I am getting a little bit of noise, so perhaps if other people could mute themselves, that would be great. So now I want to talk about herd immunity because that's in the public domain a great deal. And I want to pause for a moment and say that about a month ago, the WHO talked about herd immunity globally. And if we were going to get herd immunity globally, thinking that we might need 65 to 75% to be of the population to be immunocompetent against COVID, in the process of letting this happen naturally, 30 million people would die globally. And that's just not acceptable, which is the rationale for vaccine, of course. So if you look at the left-hand side of the slide initially, you'll look at the naive population over the population where 70% of the population is immune. And you can see in the naive population that initial red individual is the infected person, and that's an RO, or R naught, contagion of roughly 3 or 4, with COVID ranking maybe 2.5, maybe as much as 5. Now we're not exactly sure what the R naught is, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But you can see how quickly that one individual can transmit disease to numerous other people. As opposed to just below it, if 70% of the population is immune, that individual's chances of transmitting the disease is markedly less. He or she will have very unsuccessful transmission capabilities if 70% of the population is immune. Now, if you look at the right-hand side on the top, the x-axis is the R naught. So as the disease is more and more infective, and R naught means that if you have an R naught of 3, for example, that means one person can infect 3 others. You can see how the herd immunity threshold must grow greater and greater. And a great example of that is measles. In B, you can see the different illnesses arranged on the x-axis based on their R naught, based on how infectious they are, and the herd immunity threshold that is required on the y-axis. So if you look at measles, measles may well be the most infectious viral disease we know of. And in measles, the R naught is roughly 15, meaning that for every one person with measles in a naive population, they can infect 15 other people very rapidly. So you need 95% of the population to be immunized against measles. The most recent significant case of a measles outbreak occurred in late 2018, early 2019 in New York City, in which an individual came back from Israel and was part of the very, very conservative Jewish community in New York City where they don't immunize. Within days, 700 cases of measles were seen in this local community. And one of the fears that we have had around the pandemic, when children were becoming delayed in terms of their immunizations because families were not going in to see their providers, that we would see measles outbreak. And just yesterday, I saw an article, and this was really referring to the global circumstance of measles. But death rates have grown substantially this year and part of last year from a measles perspective because of delay in vaccination. And I think that there are some people in the community who think that because we don't see measles anymore, measles is not there, we don't need to worry about immunization. No, in fact, the measles virus is there. It's just waiting to gain a foothold, and it doesn't need much of one if you need 95% of the population to be immune. And you can see where COVID-19 ranks. SARS to the left of COVID-19 refers to SARS-CoV-1, and then you can see H1N1 influenza and where it ranks. And again, the higher the basic reproduction numbers, the greater the need for more individuals to be immune within the community. So in general, we know that confidence is a key to ensuring high vaccination rates. And we're going to show a slide in a minute that shows where we were this summer in terms of acceptance of COVID-19 vaccination. But the point being that even if we came up with a very, very effective vaccine for COVID-19, if we have an inadequate number within the population to accept the vaccine, then we are still not going to achieve herd immunity. And I think the flu vaccine is a great example. So it's viewed very differently from other vaccines. It's more of a nice to have rather than a need to have in some people's minds. There is a higher level of hesitancy with respect to the flu. I think we've all heard patients say, well, I got the flu from the flu vaccine, or it didn't really help me. And there are significant misconceptions about the effectiveness of the vaccine, and they don't realize that the strains have to change each year, and that sometimes, despite the best predictive models, you might miss which strains need to be in the flu vaccine for any given year. But I think the troubling thing is that the influenza vaccination trends can sometimes inform the acceptance rates for COVID-19 vaccine. I will say that we are seeing better uptake of the flu vaccine this year, due in large part to the recognition by many healthcare providers that they need to be encouraging their patients to get the flu vaccine. So this talks about acceptance, and it's very, very variable. So people who are older have a tendency to plan to get vaccinated. People who are white, people of minority populations have a tendency less likely to be vaccinated against COVID-19. We're going to talk in a minute about the differences in what drives them in terms of what people are thinking. But we are aware of minority populations and their concerns about the healthcare, the nature of healthcare in general, and particularly the nature of healthcare research. So this gives you the reasons for why, if somebody's going to vaccinate, they would, and why, if they're not going to vaccinate, they would not. And we're going to talk about the would not group first. A large part of that is by side effect concerns, but there is a significant percentage that is concerned that they're actually going to get COVID from the vaccine itself. There's also a significant percentage of individuals who are naysayers, who feel that COVID-19 is not a big deal. There's another group that don't feel vaccines work very well. And I'm going to stop just a second and say that I took a look at a new poll that came out yesterday. So they polled people again, and by they, I don't mean Pfizer. This was a government polled individuals this week about whether or not they would be willing to get a coronavirus vaccine, and it was substantially higher. And I suspect it's based on that bullet of, I don't think vaccines work very well, given the vaccine, the preliminary vaccine efficacy that was published this week. And we still have a considerable number of people that don't feel that the outbreak is serious. And that's really a concern as we move out into some states. So we're all aware, I believe, of the concern of how quickly we're ramping up again this winter. I have a colleague on the medical team who lives in South Dakota, and in South Dakota, there's no mask mandate. And that person suspects that less than 50% of people ever wear a mask in that state. So per capita, they have seen an excessively high rate of COVID-19 infections really in the last 6 weeks. But why would you get a vaccine? Because you want to protect yourself, you want to protect your family, you want to protect your community, and you want to get back to work. And there is a healthy percentage that will do it just based on whether their physician recommends that they use it. So we've had some recent infectious disease concerns, and that has affected vaccines. So the H1N1 vaccine only became available really after the pandemic peaked. SARS-CoV-1 and Zika outbreaks ended before development was complete. The Ebola vaccine is available, and it is being used in certain countries still. It's an interesting vaccination pattern in that if they identify a case of an individual with Ebola, then they will turn around and vaccinate everybody that has come into close contact with that person. So it's not a mass vaccination program. I think it has become less recognized in the United States because, quite frankly, we did not suffer from Ebola as some individual countries did. We know that there are some key determinants of vaccine confidence, and I think we're all aware of them. I think the number one concern that drives all of these determinants is that science is being challenged by mistrust and misinformation. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to work with the public and show information transparently that is scientific and is not based on opinion. That's probably the most important thing. And I think this next slide will be of great help. So I think that individuals thought that our current mechanism of coming up with this year was just thought up in a couple of hours in a back room in March. And nothing could be farther from the truth. So with SARS-CoV-1, a pandemic preparedness committee was put together by President Bush, has been working with the CDC to try to shorten vaccine development plans should we be faced with new outbreaks. And there's no question that this is not the last one we will ever see. We saw SARS-CoV-1. MERS is still an issue, although not in this country. That's more in the Middle East and in Mediterranean countries. And there's differences in contagion, but there's also differences in mortality. So Ebola and MERS have much higher mortality rates than SARS-CoV-2. However, SARS-CoV-2 is much more contagious. If you take a look at the traditional vaccine paradigm, which is on top, each phase is done sequentially. And you only move from preclinical to phase 1 or phase 1 to phase 2 if you have good proof of concept or good efficacy. What we're doing in the lower hand portion of the slide with the pandemic outbreak paradigm is we're doing everything at once, which means that for Pfizer, we're doing everything at risk. We're not waiting to find out, for example, if preclinical and phase 1 and phase 2 look good. We're going ahead and investing in all of it and starting large-scale manufacturing up front. We right now probably have roughly $2 billion invested in this vaccine. And I think you've probably been seeing a lot in the public domain about Operation Warp Speed and the government's involvement with Pfizer. We've had no involvement with the government to date. We only have involvement with the government if we have an effective vaccine that is approved for use, and then we're paid for the vaccine as it's distributed. So we got no upfront costs from an R&D perspective. So typically we don't do vaccine development this way because it puts up a lot of cost up front. But this is the pandemic paradigm, and it's been widely accepted and has been done for the other pandemics. I think the important thing to recognize is that safety is manifest. We have 44,000 people in our current phase 2 and phase 3 development program. And if you look at the standard years traditional paradigm, you can have anywhere from 30 to 60,000 subjects enrolled in those studies. So we are not sacrificing safety by doing all of these phases at the same time. So I think that's important for people to understand when they become concerned about safety. There is a great deal of operational complexity inherent in a pandemic and pandemic vaccine trials. There are a number of agencies involved in analyzing the safety of these vaccines, and you will see that as we go along. One of the things that we have had to do with our studies is try to place trial sites where there is a pandemic hotspot. Because in addition to immunogenicity data, which we have had since phase 1 and has been published, that's published in the New England Journal of Medicine after our phase 1. So we had immunogenicity studies looking at antibody development, and people might ask, well, how did you take a look at that? So with our vaccine trials early on, we were trying to achieve an antibody response similar to what we saw in human serum convalescent antibody titers. So those individuals who became ill with COVID, who were hospitalized and had measurable antibodies, we were trying to pair our antibody response to at least theirs. We achieved more than that. The other thing we were looking at were T and B cell immune memory in our trials, early immunogenicity trials, and we appear to have that as well. However, that is not necessarily a marker of vaccine efficacy. You still need vaccine efficacy. And by that, I mean that if you have a placebo arm and a vaccine arm, which we have in our trials and is seen in all vaccine trials, what you're looking for is a disease incidence in the placebo arm. So for example, if there were 100 cases that arose in the placebo arm of a vaccine trial for any infectious disease, but we'll say 20 cases in the vaccine arm, then that would indicate you have very reasonable vaccine efficacy. And for the purposes of COVID, what the FDA, CDC, ACIP were looking for were 50% efficacy or better. Our trials were designed and powered to hopefully look for 60% or better efficacy. And I think everybody's familiar with the data that came out this week. The FDA put together specific guidance to look at COVID-19. So it was guidance for industry in their development and licensure of any vaccines referable to COVID-19, looking particularly at regulatory requirements. And so that is in the public domain. Anybody can search for that and find that on the FDA, US FDA website. So the FDA has been working for the Center of Biologics and that's true for all biologics. That includes vaccines, that includes biosimilars, that includes some of the biologics that are used for inflammatory diseases as well as neurologic diseases and some infectious diseases as well. No difference now compared to other times. I think where people are uncertain is, what does an emergency use authorization look like? And you will see that there is an ongoing rapid review of all regulatory submissions. It doesn't necessarily happen when you are submitting for other medications where there's not a pandemic. So the submission rate and the review rate is much faster. So what is an emergency use authorization? If you have a public health emergency that has been declared, which is true for COVID-19, then it can be utilized. And it's really all about benefit risk ratio. Does the benefit of this potential treatment outweigh the risk of giving a drug or medicine or vaccine that is not fully licensed? And licensure takes a longer period of time to achieve. So the FDA takes a look at the potential for serious outcomes, which of course in COVID-19 we have serious outcomes, including death, and whether or not that outweighs the known risks for the product. So to give you a little bit of an idea, people who I think have already had the idea that an EUA has been issued for our vaccine already, that's not the case. All we did was present the initial, and I really stress the word initial, vaccine efficacy clinical data. The safety data, as requested by the FDA, was 2 months worth of safety data, and that will likely be achieved by mid next week or so, which will then be submitted to the FDA. The last information that we saw would be that the FDA has roughly 10 days or so to review all of that before they decide to issue an EUA, which would put us a little bit after Thanksgiving, most likely. So this is the process. They ask for clinical data, they ask for safety data, they ask for our study reports, and they take a look at it. It is reams and reams of data that has to be evaluated. And something I always point out to patients who ask me this question, I will say it's not in the FDA or the CDC's best interest, nor is it in any pharmaceutical company's interest to submit a medication that is not safe, that will not be helpful to anyone, including the target population. So safety is not being compromised. It remains a priority. It has been stressed and stressed and stressed. There are multiple government agencies using both complementary systems and a little bit different methodology to monitor the vaccines. One of the key systems that will be used is the one that's always used, which is the Vaccines Adverse Event Reporting System, which takes a look at all vaccines and is an ongoing process indefinitely for the life of the use of the vaccine. And that will be used both for an EUA and post-licensure, assuming that a licensure will be obtained. And it occurs in very close to real time. In addition, there will be ongoing post-marketing safety studies, and I think that there's been a lot in the public domain about our studies. So the phase 3 component of our studies began July 27th. Everyone who is in those studies in both the placebo arm and in the vaccination arm will be followed for 2 years. Regardless of what happens with an EUA or potential licensure, they will continue to be followed to look for very uncommon delayed adverse events. And those would be uncommon, but they will be evaluated. In terms of pregnancy, which is another concern that many individuals have, and so there has been some discussion from the CDC about enrolling women who are pregnant. As you can imagine, that's a whole different regulatory concern. So at the moment, it is a pregnancy exposure registry, very similar to a lot of the oral medications we use, as well as all the biosimilars and other biologics, that they have pregnancy registries so that if somebody becomes pregnant after exposure to the vaccine or concurrently with the vaccine, that information about the result of their pregnancy will be collected and analyzed. These are the partners that are working together in the implementation of this COVID-19 vaccination. And I think there's been a lot, again, in the public domain about some of these different groups. They all have some degree of oversight. So, for example, the CDC, along with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, as well as the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, are the ones that are putting together the tiering system for who should get vaccine first. So clearly, we're not going to have enough vaccine for everybody in the United States, let alone globally. And some of our vaccine is promised outside of the United States as well. So what does that look like? They're putting together different tiers. Tier 1A will be frontline healthcare workers and those individuals who work within long-term care and people who live within long-term care. That's really 1A. You'll have other healthcare workers as well as essential workers, people who are involved in transportation, your Amazon drivers, for example, all of those people who can't necessarily always safely socially distance, nor can they work from home. And then there's additional discussion about those over age 65 or those with comorbid conditions. And then what about school teachers? So we know we're not going to have pediatric data. We have recently, within the last several weeks, dropped our age down to 12. As part of the discussion with the FDA, we have been allowed to enroll roughly 200 children between 12 and 16. We had already dropped our age down 12 to 15. We had already dropped our age down to 16 as part of the larger phase 3 studies. I think you're probably aware of that. That's been in the public domain. But because we will not have a lot of pediatric data, then does that mean teachers and professors need to be vaccinated next? So there's been a lot of discussion with that group, for example. The Department of Defense with McKesson will be involved, for example, in disseminating a lot of materials needed for vaccination purposes. You may be aware that roughly a month ago or so, 2 months, I guess now, that many of the CEOs, including Pfizer's, signed an agreement, signed a pledge that was published because they were concerned about the politicalization of the COVID-19 development for vaccination. And so they wanted to make sure that everyone knew that even though this whole process was called Operation Warp Speed, that the companies were operating with standards and scientific principles as their guidance, not any one government. So we talked a little bit about the prioritization and the initial tiered approach. How is this looking? So the HHS and the CDC have reached out to every state Department of Health. Several weeks ago, every state Department of Health was required to submit a plan for where the distribution centers would be within their states for the vaccines, and how much vaccine was going to be needed. And so, for example, I've had a number of different, I cover multiple states, and I've had not necessarily reach out from Indiana, but I've had reach outs from other states thinking that they were either A, going to get vaccine this week, or B, they wanted to know from us how much vaccine they were going to get. That decision comes from the CDC, HHS in conjunction with the State Department of Health to determine how much vaccine allocation each state's going to get, as well as prioritization for populations who are going to be at highest risk for infection. And I think that that's an important thing to understand, that the Indiana Department of Health has determined their initial vaccine distribution sites. Physicians are probably physicians, nurse practitioners, medical assistants, physician assistants are all in a prime position to address misinformation. And one of the things that we are trying to do with our talks like this one is help people understand what the vaccine trial process looks like in the course of a pandemic, so that they can discuss that with their patients. Because again, there's that whole group in the middle who are looking for guidance from their healthcare providers to potentially counter some of the misinformation that they're hearing in social media. And there's a number of best practices. Probably the most important is not to repeat any of the anti-vaccine arguments, nor is to get into an argument, but to try to help people understand benefit risk ratios with respect to vaccination. So this is my summary slide, and then I'm going to talk a little bit. I have a little bit more information that might be helpful for you to keep as well. But vaccine confidence is going to be key for a new vaccine, but it's really important in the current frame of mind that we are in the United States, and not just in the United States, really most of the developed world is privy to the same misinformation, and so has the same hesitancy and the same concern. There are some resources that you can look to that can really help you put together information that you can hand out, that you can deliver with respect to vaccinations in general. And the one that I go to probably the most is Immunization Action Coalition. We in Indiana have a very active chapter of the IAC, and they have so many free materials that they will ship to you to your office. And I think that's important. At Pfizer, and you can just go to Pfizer.com, we have COVID-19 information and resources that are easily accessible. Not only that, that particular website will tell you where vaccine trial sites are going on now, if in case you have a patient that is interested in still becoming a potential subject. It also will give you up to the day information about how many people we have enrolled in our studies, and even how many people have received their second vaccination already, which is, I believe, 40,000 or a little bit more. And then again, there are numerous ways vaccine safety is being monitored for COVID and for all vaccines, but it's particularly important for COVID. There is electronic health record monitoring at the VA. There is on a state basis. I know I get information when I have a Medicare patient, for example, that gets a flu vaccine or gets their Prevnar 13, or they get their polysaccharide pneumonia vaccine. And again, not to overdo this, but there are multiple ways that we are continuing to monitor specific to long-term care facilities. There is going to be a customized way. There is a customized way to track infections and prevention processes, and also for essential workers. So essential workers will have something called vSafe, which will capture the first 20 million people during the first months of the vaccination program to take a look at their adverse events. So they will be checked in on via text message or email, whichever they choose, daily for the first week post-vaccination and then weekly for 6 weeks thereafter. And if there is a clinically important event, then that will activate the call center. So I'm gonna end with this slide, and I hope this has been helpful information for everyone on the call today, and hopefully will help people really be cognizant of where we are currently in this environment specific to COVID.
Well, thank you, Meg. I greatly appreciate you speaking to